Welcome to my 1998 Firebird Formula Lawn Ornament. Today we're going to talk about how I killed my transmission because I'm still waiting on parts to arrive so I can fix my rear end for the second time this year. 411 gears and a 7.5-inch GM rear end are a terrible idea, but I just can't help myself. I love the violent acceleration. So, the short answer, if you don't want to watch the entire video and you just want to know how I killed my transmission, drag is how I killed my transmission. My story of transmission woe starts on a drag strip. When I first got the car, I was pretty obsessed with drag racing, and I probably had 300 drag strip runs in the car, somewhere around there. And I was just determined to do a 12-second quarter mile. Just one of those things. You get it in your head and you get focused on it. And I was out at the drag strip one night, we had pretty good air, and I had cut a 13 flat with like a 2.0, 2.1 60 foot. And I could taste that 12-second quarter mile time slip. I knew that I had it because I knew I could do better than a 2.0, 2.1 60 foot. So I hot lap the car, don't even give it a break, pull right back up to the starting line, do a quick burnout, stage it. And then I used a launch technique which only someone who's never had to replace a clutch and a transmission can use. I revved the engine up to 5,000 RPM and held it there, and then I slipped the clutch off the line, just feathered it. I didn't get any wheel spin, and the car cut a 1.8 60 foot. Amazing. Unfortunately, that launch technique turned my clutch into a molten frisbee, and when I went to second gear, all it did is just bounce off the rev limiter, and the clutch was toast. Over the next couple of thousand miles and probably 3 or 4 months, I ended up going through 4 different clutches in the car because I'm pretty particular about the way the car drives, and the first clutch chattered really bad. The next clutch had a really sharp bite to it. I didn't like that. The next clutch was so heavy it made the car feel like it was a pickup truck. And so I finally settled on an LS7 clutch with aluminum flywheel. And because I had destroyed 2 pilot bearings while replacing all these clutches, I put in a pilot bushing based off some advice I got on LS1 Tech. Now, the pilot bushing versus a pilot bearing. Obviously the pilot bearings got little roller bearings in there, and those reduce friction significantly versus a pilot bushing. However, they're more fragile, which is why I'd gone to the pilot bushing. The best part about doing 4 clutch swaps over the course of about 2 months is that you get really good at it. I did, the first one took me about 18 hours. The last one I did took me under 4, and you get a real appreciation for those parts, and it makes it impossible to ever do a 5,000 RPM launch again. When I first installed the LS7 clutch, the first thing I noticed is that it was just a little bit notchy when you're changing gears, and so you had to be just at the right RPM, which doesn't bother me because I like rev matching and doing a lot of stuff anyways, so I just kind of ignored it. But that was the first warning sign. So I ordered a new transmission from RPM Transmissions, and to ship it over to Germany, I think it was around $3,600. So pretty expensive for a transmission that's usually $2,000, but it was totally worth it to have nice, smooth shifting again. I got to do a couple of track days. I put about 3,000 miles in the transmission, and then I deployed, and the car sat for a year. Before we get into what exactly killed the transmission, a little primer on syncros. You can think of syncros as brake pads that either speed up or slow down the input shaft depending on whether you're downshifting or upshifting. And obviously those brake pads wear more if there's more weight or drag on the input shaft. When we got back from deployment, the first thing we did was go to a track day. At the end of that track day, my transmission was destroyed again. I was back to square one. It was grinding through basically every gear. So I called up RPM Transmissions and I was like, what the hell? Right? You must have sent me a defective transmission. And so Jeremy, I think was the guy's name, asked me, he's like, all right, what clutch do you got? And do you have a pilot bearing or bushing? I told him I have an LS7 clutch and I have a pilot bushing. He said, that's why the transmission died. He's like, look at an LS7 clutch. How does it increase its load capacity? Instead of increasing the pressure on the pressure plate, what they do is they increase the friction area. A clutch never truly disengages. There's always some friction between the friction surfaces. So if you increase the friction surfaces, you increase the drag on the clutch. So all the drag stuff made sense to me, why that would wear out the syncros faster. But what didn't make sense to me was why the OEM transmission that already had 80 or 90,000 miles on it, had survived so much longer with the same pilot bushing, LS7 clutch, and Royal Purple synthetic fluid in it. What I've realized now that I understand more about oils and how they work at higher temperatures and how synchros and blocker rings work, that kind of stuff, is that I had created virtually the perfect environment for destroying a transmission. I had the Royal Purple synthetic in it, which is a relatively thin fluid running on the Autobahn at high speed so that you get your oils up to a really high temperature where it thins out quite a bit, and then getting lured into a drag race with a couple other V8 muscle cars. So the closeness of the race gave me a little bit of that red mist, and I was just banging gears like my life depended on it. So you've got hot, thin fluid, you've got mashing of the synchros, and now the synchros, instead of being asked to speed up and slow down just that little light friction disc, they're now being asked to speed up and slow down that massive engine. And then the next day I took it out on track, and for the first couple of laps it was fine, but then once the fluid got hot, we got towards the hotter part of the day, it started to thin out again. The synchros just weren't able to do their job. After about a week of negotiations with Jeremy at RPM Transmissions, he emailed me back and he said, "Sorry man, even at $3,600, the first one we sold you was basically a loss for us. We're not going to sell you another one." My old transmission had been stolen along with a bunch of my tools as I was switching houses, and so I was kind of stuck. Luckily, Jeremy had one last piece of advice for me. He said, minimize all the drag that you can. Put a pilot bearing back in it instead of a pilot bushing, and then get the lightest weight, lowest friction clutch that you can get. And he said, I think you'll be surprised at how much better the shifting gets. He said, you might still be able to race the car. And so that's what I tried. I went online to search for the lowest friction, lightest weight clutch assembly. And of course, we're talking about the actual friction disc itself, the part that sits between the pressure plate and the flywheel. And it turns out, after searching high and low and looking for, crazy exotic material clutches, the lightest clutch that you can get, at least at the time, was a stock LS1 clutch. With the help of some friends, I managed to get the transmission in and out in 2 or 3 hours, and the new LS1 clutch in there. I went to take it for a test drive. The first thing I noticed is that the pedal feel with the stock clutch is amazing, and the shifting was slick as butter. The problem is that even though it was super slick, it was still grinding. And I'm still using the Royal Purple synthetic at this point. Whenever somebody recommends a liquid solution to a mechanical problem, I always think of the shop that I worked at back in high school. And I was working one day, this lady walks in and she buys one of those engine fix in a can products. And then she asked me to pour it into her engine. I didn't realize that her car had been towed there. And so I walk out back, pour it into the engine, and I hear it pour out the bottom. I look underneath and there's what looks like a human rib bone sticking out of her oil pan. Now, obviously that engine oil fix in a can was not going to put her connecting rod back into her engine. I always assume that's who those products are targeted at, is sort of take advantage of people in desperate situations. But being in a desperate situation myself, I decided to give it a shot. I figure, what have I got to lose? So I bought a bottle of it and I poured it into the transmission. Well, really I spooned it into the transmission. I mean, this stuff is easily the second thickest substance known to man. And then I took the car out for a drive, and the first thing you notice is it is notchy as hell, especially when it's cold. You have to double clutch every single gear. So if you think back to our example of the synchros as brake pads that speed up and slow down the input shaft, think of taking a big old glob of grease and putting it on the face of a brake pad. That's essentially the same thing that you're doing with the Lucas Oil transmission fix, is you're drastically changing the amount of friction in between those synchros and the input shaft. And so now the synchros are not anywhere near as good at speeding up and slowing down the input shaft. And so shifting is really notchy. But on the plus side, it quit grinding entirely. I have done 10, probably 15 more track days with this car since then, using the same transmission and using a heavyweight oil combined with the Lucas Oil transmission fix, and it has not ground once on me, including a couple of impromptu drag races where I power shifted the car and still had no issues with it. And so after all that, I've ended up with a fully functional transmission, which has much lighter weight internals, right? Less metal and synchro. I hope you guys learned something today. Thanks for watching, and next time we'll be back to our regularly scheduled ring adventures.